What would happen within the brain in the absence of stimulus? This question happened to be what started the research with float tank therapy by neuroscientist John C. Lilly in 1954. And as we continue to discover and research today, it turns out a lot of beneficial things occur. On this special episode, I have the owners of the Infinity Float Center here in Houston, Texas. Since playing college basketball, I really enjoy cutting edge technology and modalities that boost performance, recovery, and relaxation. And that I found most beneficial for overall health has been float tank therapy. Now, I practice meditation daily and have found floating to be an almost enhanced meditation because when the body is so relaxed, it pretty much forces the mind to relax with it. And in regular meditation, it takes a little bit of practice to get into that calmer state. As you'll hear in this episode, a float tank is commonly called a sensory deprivation tank, set to close out as much sensory input as possible so you can relax to the fullest. In this episode, you'll hear a little bit about the history of floating, what it is, how it works, and what occurs in the body and the brain during a session. I hope you enjoy learning and giving it a try as soon as possible. You can check out more on floating at their website, infinityfloat.com, and on social media under the name at the Infinity Float Center. Excuse me, there's no the, just at Infinity Float Center. And if you decide to go float, make sure to let them know you heard this episode with Solomon. Also, thank you very much for listening to Season 4 of the Ebb and Flow podcast. I have an additional episode to share of an interview that I was on from my friend and recent guest, and will do my best to get it out soon. However, I will be traveling to the Holy Land of Israel for a summer adventure of studying, traveling, visiting friends and family, and decided to close out this podcast season until further notice. If you haven't yet, please leave a review about the show and today's guest on Apple Podcasts and head over to solomonezra.com or follow me on Instagram at king_Solomon8 and Facebook Solomon Ezra Berezin to learn more. Also, subscribe to my YouTube channel, Solomon Berezin, to get updates on new videos and podcasts. Finally, if you're interested in starting one of my one-on-one coaching programs, head over to the coaching services pages on my website, where you can also see some testimonials from previous clients. One is called Mindset Go, and that's geared towards athletes looking to get an edge on the performance of their mind. And the other is Cultivating Certainty, aimed to help individuals with uncertainties and anxieties transform their health. Now onto the show with Jennifer and Mark Gurley from the Infinity Float Center. I'm here today with Mark and Jennifer Gurley from the Infinity Float Center here in Clear Lake, Texas. How are you guys doing today?
We're doing well, Solomon.
Doing great.
Awesome. Well, as you mentioned before we got on the air, Jennifer and I have been in contact quite a bit because I've just been coming in, especially during the summer, nearly every other day to the float tank, because float tank therapy has something that has been just another tool that I absolutely love and appreciate its benefits in the environment that it creates to be quiet and just to listen to myself and allow the body to heal. But before we dive into that, wide and awesome conversation, I'd love to hear a little bit about you guys and how you got into float tank therapy and then wanting to start the whole float tank business.
Sure. Well, I mean, for us, it was a kind of a bit of a gradual intro and then critical mass, and it was we dove feet first in. We were living overseas. We lived overseas for quite a while for my work, so we did a lot of traveling, and had come back to the U.S. and we were looking for kind of our next venture. And I work in a pretty high stress environment in the oil and gas and power generation sector, and was just really having some tough times. We were working a lot of hours and just really stressed out. It was starting to come home with me, affecting sleep, affecting mood, affecting health, the whole 9 yards. And we were really just looking for an outlet. And I had heard of floating through probably various means, but never really checked into it. So finally decided to check into it. And this was around 2013. 2014, somewhere in that area. And at that time, there was no place in Houston, no brick and mortar place that you could go and float. Few people were doing it out of their homes, but no real business. And so we drove to Austin actually, and just kind of made a weekend of it. And ironically, ended up floating at somebody's house. We thought it was a business, but when we got there, it was somebody's house. And had a great time. It was a great experience. And so that kind of kicked us off. We started digging a little more into where we could float, and found a couple of places in Houston that, again, people were floating in their house. And we ended up buying a Samadhi tank. And Samadhis were the original float tanks, first commercial one sold back in the 70s, and put it actually here in the room that we're in at our house. And just turned this into a little kind of spa room. And we started floating regularly, and would float friends and anyone who wanted to come over. And pretty soon it was friends of friends of friends, showed up and wanted to come use the tank. And so we were seeing such good results from ourselves and everyone that we floated, that we just decided, this is something that people need, especially a city as big as Houston with the traffic and everyone jammed together. We really need a little peace and quiet. And so that's when we really went from, it's kind of a cool thing and a cool experience, to, hey, let's figure out how to make this a business. And so that was in 2016 when we really started seriously searching for a place.
Time too, because that's when it started getting big.
Exactly right. So from the time we decided we were going to open a business to the time that we opened a business, and anyone who's an entrepreneur will relate to this, in that time period, which is a lot longer than it should be, I think 3 float centers opened in Houston. So it was real interesting. It was just kind of a critical mass in the area, that really let go. Now, fortunately, they were all downtown, whereas we're still, actually, most of them are, and we are far on the south side. So, not a lot of competition. And of course, from a people perspective, there's not a lot of competition with floating anyway. There's plenty of people to go around, and too few float tanks,
So you want to balance the
That's right. But that's how we got started. It was really looking for medicine for ourselves, to be honest. And then what drove us, and what continues to drive us really, is seeing the difference and the change in people coming out of a float tank versus going into a float tank. It's so different, just a different energy. And we're trying to get that energy out in the wild, because somebody leaves our center after having a bad day or bad week, they're a little bit rough around the edges. They come in, they float, makes them feel a little bit better. They're a little bit kinder, a little bit more mellow. That energy rubs off and bounces onto the next person they interact with out in the wild. And that's really what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Had you guys gotten into any other type of meditation of sorts or healing tools before, like float tank? Because float tank it's like an enhanced meditation.
Yeah, exactly right. So I think, myself, I'll speak for myself and then let Jen go, but I'm a serial meditation practice starter and stopper, right? This is the time I'm going to meditate every single day for 30 days. And I have a personal problem. It's a challenge for me to sit quietly in a chair or lay down quietly or do any sort of poses, heaven forbid. And so I love the idea. I like thinking about meditation probably more than I like meditation. And the float tank allows me to do that. It allows me to actually meditate. And that's what I try to tell people is it's almost forced meditation. You have nothing else.
Just thinking,
So it's really nice. And actually, again, back when we first discovered floating, we both are very big advocates on massage, on taking care of yourself. And we're both physically active, we exercise. And I think we were just looking for a deeper way to just reset our psyche.
Yeah, just a way to slow down in general. everything is always so busy, 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 and it just come to a head at some point with us. And when we, I think you and I were talking about this the other day, Solomon. And when we finally were able to stop, like the first time you got in a float tank, you realized that there was nothing happening. That was amazing. And same thing. That's the only way I can come close to a meditation practice is to get in a float tank, because I am just still constantly going. And so I start realizing I'm too wound up, and I go and jump in the float tank, and everything calms back down for me.
It's such like an introduction, or really like an initiation to really what relaxation is. Because, you know, as like growing up, you know, playing sports, you know, we have an off day. Well, what do we do for relaxation? You know, you sit on the couch, you watch television, or you're on your phone, but really none of that stuff is conducive with relaxation. So it's like when you really, you know, go into a meditation, or like we were saying, a forced meditation in a positive sense, it's like, oh, that's what it means to relax.
Right.
Well, and we were just talking about this last night, actually. There's a difference too, just in the last, you know, very recent period, since really the advent of smartphones, we really have no mental downtime during the day unless we proactively choose it.
Yeah.
If you think about, you know, just look around you as you're traveling outside. Every time somebody stops at a stoplight, they're typically picking up their phone. The first thing you do if you're waiting in line at a grocery store, you pick up your phone. And whether it may be, you know, maybe you're not surfing social media, maybe you're reading a book, or you're, you know, doing something that to somebody might think they're being productive. But what happens is, now from the time you woke up to the time you go to sleep, your brain is always processing something. You're always doing something. There's no downtime or boredom for your brain. So when you schedule an hour and a half of absolute nothingness, then it lets your body and your mind rest a little bit. So I think that's a big secret to it. I think there's part of that secret sauce is just shutting off.
All right, so we've really just dove right into a lot of it. Let's for people who have seen, like me, I post a lot especially when I go into the float tank. I'm often filming myself, like opening the door and, you know, the lights turning off. And we've talked a lot about like floating, but I want to go back to the basics. Like what is floating? What's with the Epsom salt?
Sure.
The container that is also just like, you know, it blocks out any kind of signal from getting in there.
Yeah. So let me, I would say back up just a hair on how floating got started and what we thought was going to happen. This actually got started as a military experiment, believe it or not, back in the 50s. It was a program that was trying to understand if you take away all sensory input from the human mind, what happens? And the theory, the hypothesis was you would shut down, that people couldn't handle it. And it was actually thought it was going to be a form of torture and be a really bad thing. Obviously, we know now it had the complete opposite effect, right? People came out of the experience saying, wow, I feel refreshed and feel awesome and feel great. Now, they were way different tanks back then. The idea was to submerge yourself in water. That was the best way they could normalize sensory input. So that's kind of where the water came from, because the hardest thing to take away is gravity. You always feel gravity, right? And you have pinch points on your joints and something becomes achy. And so they initially did it with regular salt, with table salt or ocean salt.
So nobody was floating.
No, they were. Yep, they would put a lot of salt in, and you would do it. But you know, Epsom salt is not actual salt; it's just a mineral. We just call it a salt because it looks like it. When you look at the sodium chloride salt, it's actually very abrasive. It will irritate your skin after a while. If you've been in the ocean for a while, you know this. It dehydrates you. You'll get pruny hands, things like that. If you've noticed, after an hour and a half in a float tank, you have no pruny hands. You can float all night. You won't have pruny hands. It doesn't dehydrate your skin. So they switched over to Epsom salt because it's better for you. I mean, Epsom salt itself has really restorative properties on your skin, magnesium sulfate. And it's just a cleaner, more hygienic substrate. So the idea is, and what we've evolved into, is there's typically about 10 inches of water in the tank. Now, if you look up a float tank online, you're going to see a lot of different variations. The most common is what they call a pod. That's like a kind of an eggshell that, you know, clams up and clams down, and you crawl in. The ones that you see behind me, and obviously you've seen the Center Solomon, are cabins. And these are popular because they're really big. You can walk around inside of them. We can float really big people. We floated, I think, 6'8" foot also. We floated some really big lads that have come in there. And one of the reasons we picked it, the two biggest, were mobility. So people get a lot of benefit from floating when they have chronic pain or joint injuries. And so we wanted to make it as easy as possible to get in and out of the tank. And some of the pods that you see on the market are quite difficult to crawl into. And then the other thing is, people get nervous. Our most common question is, what about, you know, what if I'm claustrophobic?
Yeah. And
so typically when they see the big cabins, that alleviates some of those fears. So back to what it is mechanically. It's specially constructed with to be light proof and soundproof. The rooms themselves, when we built the center, we tore everything down to the studs and reconstructed those rooms, especially to be soundproof. Yeah. So those are a little over a foot thick walls with air gaps in between, with insulation. We've taken a lot of special precautions to make sure everything is sealed with special acoustic dampening properties. And then the tanks themselves are constructed like that. So the idea is you absolutely hear nothing. Matter of fact, typically the only thing you hear is your heartbeat, your breathing. So that takes away the hearing. Obviously it's light proof. So, you know, when we first opened, it was always a kick to me how many people came out. And that was the big takeaway was, wow, I've never been in darkness like that before. Yeah. If you think about it, even in your bedroom at night, there's typically LEDs that are flashing somewhere. There's light coming in from the moon that's shining through the window. You know, there's something. But as you know, you cannot tell if your eyes are open or closed. It's a very unique experience in today's world.
It even seems darker with eyes open.
It does. There's something psychological about it, right? And then, of course, you've got the water. So you've got 10 inches of water. We dissolve 1,200 pounds of Epsom salt in each tank. So it's super saturated. So you're it's a very dense water. Mm-hmm. Now it looks crystal clear, but 1,200 pounds of Epsom salt makes that very dense. So you float like a cork. As soon as you lay back, you pop up. And we've had people worry about floating, and, you know, everyone floats in these tanks, period. And then the last thing we do, so that takes care of the gravity. And we have a very specific gravity that we keep it at. We check this every week, and we top off with salt and water. And it's a very specific gravity, because you don't want to sink too low. Obviously, you don't want to get it in your eyes. You don't want to float too high, because then you'll actually defeat the purpose of gravity, because you'll lay your back will arch, and you'll actually lay on top of the water instead of floating into the water. So it's a very, very precise area that we keep it in.
Wait, so you guys keep it at that? Like, how do you make sure somebody doesn't float to the top?
We have devices that measure the specific gravity, and we keep an eye on that every week. We have a maintenance day on Tuesdays, and so we go in and do maintenance on the tanks and, you know, anything with the pumps, and we check the water, because every time somebody gets out of the tank, they take a little salt with them, right? Because they have salt on their body. So
take a little water with them.
And they take a little water with them. So we're constantly topping up and making sure that mix is correct.
I was thinking about that today when I was floating. Like, my thighs, like some parts of the body aren't getting fully immersed in the water.
Correct. Interesting. Yeah. And then the last thing, of course, is temperature. So we warm the water to what we call skin receptor neutral. which is about 93.5 degrees. There's a range there. Some people run a little bit hotter than others, of course. But what we're trying to do is control the environment such that there is the absolute minimum amount of input that your brain has to come up with, right? That has to process. So if you're in a perfect float, you should not feel any effects of gravity. There's no pinch points or hot spots on your joints. Your sense of temperature should normalize between what's above water and what's below water. And of course, you shouldn't be hearing anything or seeing anything. Yeah. So what happens to the brain when it doesn't have anything to process, it actually goes into theta state and drops down into a very deep relaxed state, like when you're sleeping, except you're conscious. And a lot of people do fall asleep. A lot of people go in there and take a power nap for an hour and a half. But it's just a very restorative mode that you drop into very quickly once you become accustomed to all the mechanical things of just getting in the water and how to float. The more you practice, you drop into a very meditative state. And then there's a couple of ways you can go from there of how to do your experience. But that's the basics, is you're just taking all of the inputs that we normally have to process. Once you take those away, your body's able to just kind of take a sigh.
You mentioned a little bit about brain waves, and I learned that that's really how meditation works, is you're getting past the beta, or getting beyond the beta level of the brainwave, beta into like alpha. But you mentioned theta. Now, does alpha is really the kind of creative state, and theta is now, like you said, even more into that dreamy, sleepy state. Now, does all of the benefit of like the sensory deprivation, the dark light, the Epsom salt, does that kind of, in a way, get even beyond like to the theta a little bit?
Well, I mean, you would need some pretty good equipment to really answer it for sure. But anecdotally, yes, you're supposedly getting into theta state mind. Now, there has been a lot of clinical research over the last few years where they've done active MRIs before and then right after float sessions. There was some pretty big studies going on, and you can go online and I can share them with you if you want to throw them in the notes. There's some websites that have aggregated all the recent clinical studies on flotation. Around people with anxiety disorders and PTSD, right? Like really medically diagnosed anxiety disorders. Some that were super severe. These people had been on medications for a long time, et cetera. And this was done at, in a medical facility. They built a float center essentially in a medical facility. So they could do an active MRI, literally wheel somebody down the hall, have a float, and then wheel them back in and do another MRI. And that's about as close as we can get to real time until somebody figures out how to do an MRI during a float tank, during a float session. But the, all of the studies and all the tests and the various methods of measuring are all pretty conclusive that your brain calms way down. You become more absorbent to thoughts, to ideas, which is one of the hallmarks of a theta state type of experience. It's super learning. There's a lot of evidence, again, anecdotal, that things that you do in the float tank can help. You can learn things a lot faster. So people listen to audiobooks, they listen to pre-recorded studies, pre-recorded meditations. There's a lot of evidence around language learning. There's a really good book called Stealing Fire about the US military using float tanks as part of Navy SEAL training and as part of language studies, doing rapid language indoctrination. Yeah. So there's a lot of good stuff. I mean, I think for me, what it boils down to is the calmer state of mind you're in, the more receptive and focused you can become on anything you put your mind to.
I think you could even put like a hypnotherapy kind of audio in there too.
For sure.
When the brain waves are down, you're more suggestible and less less in your conscious thinking brain, which
Correct.
allows information to just come in.
Yeah, and what I've grown to do is I have what I call passive and active floats, and it just depends on what my goal is going in and what my frame of mind is. And what I mean by that is when I have a passive float, I'm just tired, I'm wore out, I'm overstressed. I'm not gonna, I don't want to count my breaths. I don't want to meditate. I don't want to do anything. I just want to go in there and let my mind wander, right? Maybe fall asleep. I typically have a hard time falling asleep in a tank, just because of the position, but just let my mind wander. When I do an active float, I'm usually going in with some sort of purpose. I have a problem I'm wrestling with. I've got some sort of creative challenge, or I just kind of want to sort my week out, or reflect back on something. So I'll go in, do my normal routine, get settled, and then I begin my kind of mental checklist of what am I working on? Mm-hmm. And it is fascinating how expansive your mind can become when just simply taking away sight and sound. You can really delve into the inner mind and keep things in your head and work through problems very easily. It's amazing.
Yeah. I find in my experience, especially recently, perhaps because of the number of times I've been doing it, and I was talking to Jennifer about this. Often like the first floats, it is really relaxing, but a lot of like that deep experience, like we said, enhanced meditation also, and like even doing the passive floating, which pretty much is what I'll do, because I'll in the morning do a guided meditation. So when I'm in the float tank, I just like to, be there in the silence. I just listen to whatever wants to come to the surface. But with that, and anybody who understands a little bit of the process of transformation or change, when you've been, let's say you have a certain habit or a limited behavior or way of thinking about something, those thoughts are going to run, and all the thoughts that are connected to that. And so with that, a lot of this tension rises. So like I would talk to Jennifer, like my wrist or my forearm sometimes would get like like super intense, like it's supposed to be sensory deprivation, like you're like beyond that, and it's like there's no feeling, in my chest or my torso, but like the forearms and the fingers are like gripping up onto something.
Yeah.
So do you have any experience with people coming in and talking about that? How do you explain that whole process? Because it really does bring everything to the surface.
Well, it's interesting you say that. Years ago, we were at a float conference talking to some of the original doctors that were working on this back in the 70s and 80s. And one of them, and I forget who said it, but one of them had even mentioned that they didn't like the term sensory deprivation, that they actually preferred sensory enhancement, because while yes, you are taking away sensory input, it allows the mind to now become aware of things that it's not normally aware of. So there's something called Interreception as well. So Interreception is basically your ability to feel internally what your body is doing. Are you hungry? Is your bladder full? Are your lungs fully inflated, or are you taking shallow breaths? And normally during the day, while we're doing something, again, we're processing so many things at one time. How many times do you really are aware of your heartbeat, right? Well, your heart's beating 24/7, but how many times are you really aware of it? So when you get in the tank, I guarantee you will be aware of your heartbeat. I mean, you can feel it rippling the water sometimes, right? So what happens if you think about, if anyone in TV or works on this, you look at an oscilloscope and you see like a lot of the peaks and valleys and things of like noise on a digital screen, right? Well, think about a float tank lowering all of that. You lower the entire spectrum of ups and downs that your body's having to process. And once you get down to a certain base level, well, that's where now some of the top peaks are your heartbeat, is your internal digestive system, and also things that are maybe afflicting you. So people will come out and say, hey, my ankle's a little sore now because they were focused on their ankle and they twisted it 2 weeks ago. Or some people come out and say, hey, my neck's a little tight. Well, it's because you are very aware your neck was tight going in, but now you've dampened everything else down to where you can really focus on that. And that's a good thing. Your body now can really focus on what's going on there. So I think what you're describing is that it's that tendency of when we're reading a good book and it gets to a really, intense part, your shoulders will start bunching up, or you start tightening and tensing your breathing when you're watching a thriller movie. That kind of stuff you don't notice during normal days. But when you're in a float tank and you may be thinking about something that is maybe challenging, or it has some sort of visceral effect on you, it might express itself in physical sensation. So that might be something you're experiencing.
Yeah, especially when it's some type of like a trauma or something, somebody.
Of course, yeah. And like I said, a lot of the latest medical studies have been focused really on people with hyperanxiety and hypervigilance, like really heavy levels of depression, things like that. And it's worked really well. The other thing that it's actually we're seeing a lot of great benefits for is PTSD, with people that have gone through traumatic episodes in their life, either personally or obviously a lot of military, right? We have a ton of military, unfortunately, that suffers very heavily from PTSD. And one of the things one of the reasons this is working so well for those people is the float tank. Think of it as a muscle memory almost. When you are in that float tank, your body is so relaxed that your mind is forced to relax with it. There is a very well-studied, well-documented correlation that if you relax the body, your mind almost cannot be in a frenzied panic state of mind. It pulls it down with it. And so what this does is allows, in some cases over time, it's not a magic pill, but it allows your memory to remember that state of mind in the tank and take that outside with you. So, and I would challenge you to do this, since you've been floating back to back to back quite a bit. Once you get comfortable in that space, when you're out in the real world, when you're traveling in a plane or you're at a stoplight or anything, and you feel a little stressed out, take a second, take a deep breath, close your eyes, and remember the last time you floated. Remember that stillness, that peacefulness, and your body remembers that. Your body will calm down. And so that's what's helping a lot of these people when they start having panic attacks due to PTSD. It helps them. Now they have a frame of reference of a place that they did not have any sort of negative inputs to, which is the float tank. So they can remember that safe space, so to speak.
Yeah. I like what you said about when the body's in such a state of relaxation, the mind is almost like forced to go into that. Because I learned, like we were a little bit with the brain waves, that you can only take in and receive information that's equal to your state of being. And we've learned, and it's a whole other conversation about the mind-body connection and as well as the body-mind connection. But all that we've been discussing is that it just really gets the whole body, including the brain, into that state. Wow.
Yeah.
There's a lot more to discuss and to learn and to continue to learn as more research comes out. But how do you encourage, like what could somebody come in with? Like we mentioned different things like PTSD, depression. I know performance enhancement. We touched a little bit about the like passive floating and active floating. How would you encourage somebody also to give it a try, because it can also be quite intimidating to
Sure.
go into a dark room and to float?
So I think, first of all, find a float center near you, and just go check it out. I've never run across a float center or a float center owner that isn't super happy to show you around, to show you how it works. It's not a mysterious, you've got to pay $5 to see behind the curtain. We've been really fortunate to be able to travel a lot. We've traveled all over the world, and since we got into floating, we now float everywhere. So I've floated in Europe, we floated in New Zealand and Australia, and of course all over the US, Middle East. Yeah, we floated in Dubai not too long ago, and there's a wide variety of ways to go about your float center. So I would say just find one near you, go in, check it out, see what kind of equipment they have, see the float attendant will walk you through everything and alleviate some of that just fear of the unknown. That's the first thing to get over. The second thing I'll tell people is you don't have to have anxiety. You don't have to have PTSD. You don't have to be an athlete. You don't have to have an injury. Just go to check out. Have you run into too many people this week? Have you answered too many video calls this week? Have you been on the phone too much? All of us have this issue. There's not anyone that I know of in daily life these days that doesn't need to unplug a little bit. So I guarantee you need to do this. And what I'll leave you with for the intro people is we have a very heavy recommendation to float 3 times. Float 3 times before you make any sort of assessment, positive or negative, about it. The reason I say that is the first time you get into this experience, this float tank, it is a novel experience. You have never been in a situation like this since you left the womb, right? So a lot of people, their first float is a lot of experimenting. It's a lot of discovery. It's figuring out, how do you want to position your hands? Do I want to leave my eyes open, or do I want to close my eyes? And you're bumping against the walls, and should I move my feet, and whatever. There's a lot of experiential things that are happening, not a lot of calm floating. So I say, like, the first hour that you float, you're really getting about 25 to 30 minutes of real floating, right? And when you leave, come back soon. We don't want you to wait 3 months to come back for your second float, because it will almost turn into a novel experience again. So I would, a good recommendation would be like once a week for 3 weeks. And then by the third float, now you're familiar with the process. All of that is mundane to you. You know how you like to float. Do you like to float with your arms above your head, or behind your back, or down by your sides? You can experiment with, do you like floating in the morning or in the evening at the end of the day? I personally do not like floating in the evening. I like floating mid-morning or early morning. So you'll learn that about yourself. Then you can have a little bit more understanding of how you want to proceed. Do I want to float once a month? Do I want to float once a week? Do I want to float like Solomon and go every day?
Hey, I just had to take advantage of the summer deal that you guys had.
Oh, that's exactly why we did it. So I would just say, don't, because it's such a new experience, if you've never floated, try not to, even if you loved it, try not to make a judgment after the first float. You want to float a few times.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, and I do want to point out that, we're talking about the extremes of people. Like, again, if you look at professional sports, every professional sports team now is very vocal about having flotation in their training regime and in their visualization paradigm, because it's proven successful. There's tons of athletes that speak out for it, and just muscle recovery and physical ailment recovery. We have a lot of people that come in with chronic pain, chronic back issues, chronic neck issues, and they come out and they can move a little bit better. But again, just as a preventative, healthy, I just want to take a breath.
Just disconnecting, yeah.
Just disconnect, yeah. So don't think you have to have something wrong. This is about relaxation and checking out a little bit.
Amazing. Well, Mark and Jennifer, it's been a pleasure getting to know you guys by coming into the shop. I hope to meet you, Mark, in person soon enough.
We'll make it happen.
But how can people, if they're interested, check out more about the Infinity Float Center and about float tanks and come in and check you guys out?
So the easiest way is our website, infinityfloat.com. That has all the information about our center. You can see video walkthroughs of our tanks and how everything works. You can give us a call directly to the store at 281-486-1864. And then we're on all the socials. So, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, we're always posting different things. A lot of our clients post things like yourself.
Right.
So yeah, the easiest way is the website is kind of the hub of everything and gives you all the information.
Yeah. And you guys also offered massages, and one time I did a massage, acupuncture, and float.
Yeah, we do massage and acupuncture on site as well. And yeah, if you really want to come out like a loose noodle, get all three done, and you'll have a good day.
It also made, like we were talking earlier, it made my mind so active after all of that relaxation. I couldn't. It was just like everything just came to the surface.
Right. Yeah.
I'd love to see like either a cold pool or a cryotherapy tank in there right after a float.
Yep.
Yeah.
That'll like wake you up after the relaxation.
So the modalities that are most common are massage. That's typically goes hand in hand, but there are a few float centers that have cold dip pools and saunas. So you go back and forth between a cold dip pool and sauna, and then you do a float. Yeah, it'd be amazing. I haven't done that yet, but it'd be amazing.
That's part of my vision. I want to create that space as well. You go into a float, you get out, get in that dip in that cold pool, and now you're ready for the whole day.
Yeah.
A nice cup of coffee and
you can do anything. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, guys, thank you so much for coming on. Looking forward to talking again soon.
Anytime. Thank you,
Thanks,
Solomon.